Thanks. I've started recording.
Hi, you guys. I'm just going to hit this button really quick here. All right. Welcome to our Friday beading hour. And our project today is a loomed design with bugle beads. And it's really fun. It comes in these gorgeous colors, and you can make these relatively quickly. And I thought, what a cool idea to show. Something I get asked about a lot is how to create a loomed in button closure. And so bugles are kind of an ideal way. This would work with other beads, but bugles make it really easy to see the kind of the anatomy of the stitch. And so we have Meredith with us today because she's the expert on the Beadalon jewel loom, which is what I'm going to be using to create it. And so I was going to show the loom, and then if you guys want to say hi to Meredith, she's here.
Hey, beauty friends, just a quick bump in for me to say hi. I will be over in the chat and answering any questions that you might have about the jewel loom or about Beadalon or about any of the materials that Danielle is using today. I'm just so excited to be part of the class. It's nice to be invited to the party. So looking forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Meredith. All right, so this is diving right in. We've got beautiful beads on the mat here. So these are the beads that I'm using today. There are two different colors of bugle beads, and these are size 3 Czech bugles. And the reason I went with two different colors is just so, you know, not only does it look cool, but it also just makes it easier to see, you know, one side from the other side. And then I brought in a bright color of size 10 Czech rounds. And the 10s are, they're just a really nice fit with the bugle bead from the perspective of the width of the bead and also the height. So that's why I went with the 10s. And they're really easy to get the needle through on some of these, we'll have to go through them about 3 times. So it helps to have a 10 for that. And then of course, you'll need the jewel loom. And so this is the one they have at Michael's. It's the one I held up a minute ago. And when you unpack it, you get a flat version that needs to be bent with a tension rod. And so this is the tension rod. And you go ahead and just put that in. And there's a method that works really well. If you press it against your belly to kind of help you bend it, it can help you get the belly method, as we've been calling it. So that will make that easier to work with. I'm just going to clear these off really quick. Okay, and then so for other things you'll need some Wildfire. I'm using the .006 today. And you'll need some scissors to trim it. And so for beading needles, now in the handout, I've got size 12s as the one that I'm using, and 12s are great for the way that I'm going to do weaving in the warps and the leftover weft. So that's why I went with 12s. But if you like using the looming needle for the looming part, that will work just fine too. I just, to simplify it, we'll just be working with a regular needle because it's not a super wide project. So it works with any. And then of course you'll need a button. This button does have a shank on it. And this is a really full class, so I don't know if there'll be time, but there is a way you guys can find, if you look up on the web, lots of different ways to do non-shank buttons, but today I am using one that has a shank, so we can show how to loom that in to your design. Okay. And so the setup for this, it's set up in the standard way. And the only real difference, what I'm going to do today from what you may have seen before in looming, is I'm going to set it up for a bugle bead with a 10 in between each one. And I'd like to start my looms by just tying a quick double knot onto the bar. So what I do is I make a loop and bring that through 2 times like that. And then bring that onto the bar and then just tighten it. And I'll give that one more knot here at the top. All right. And so once that's secured, at the back of the loom, there's this little knob, and we use that to make our turns to go over and over. And so the first thing I'm going to do now that I've got this knot is just come back here and go around it one time. And then just choose one spot. So it's not super critical where you start here. the design is about this wide. So just, you know, somewhere kind of in the center. And as far as when you come down to the bottom, coming over the bar at the bottom, just kind of approximate. It doesn't have to be an exact straight line. It won't hurt your work. But I always just kind of eyeball it and see where it is and try to, you know, hit a spot that's roughly equivalent. The bar helps because it gives you a line to look at. And then here I'm flipping it over. And sorry, I got a tangle there. Coming around the bar. All right, and so for this pass, I'm going to go just one notch over on this one. That's for my size 10 bead. I'm coming down here, same thing over here. All right, I'm just going to flip it over. I'll loop around my bar again. And now I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to skip 4 spaces. I found that to be a kind of nice number for the size 3 bugles. So here's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Got my phone kind of awkwardly positioned, so there we go. So space of about 4 there. And I think 3 would work too. So, you know, it's not something that's super critical. That's just what I'm doing here. 3, 4. So I'm going on that 5th one after skipping 4. Around the bar at the back. Now let's come back up and just go right next to it. That's our middle size 10. This pattern is worked as a 10, bugle 10, bugle 10. So up here, what I'm doing here is just same spot on the bar, coming around the knob at the back. Again, I'm going to skip 4. So here's right there. I'm keeping this tension somewhat tight, but I'm not sweating it too much because when we pull the bar out, that's the next thing I'm going to do when I'm done here. It makes it much, much tighter. There's the knob at the back, doing that again. And now just going over 1 space, right? So this is our last trip up the warp there. And there it is. So now I just need to secure this. So to secure it, go ahead and come over the back, go around the knob one more time. And then I like to just go to the other side of the bar here, give myself some tail so I can do another knot. And then go ahead and go around a few times, just to secure it while you're knotting. This part can be a little tricky because you have to tie a knot while holding it. But if you go around one more time, and then just, you know, patience and a little bit of luck, and I get this through. There we go. I just made a knot kind of off loom so I can pull it on around. There we go. Okay. And because of what I'm going to do next, I really want to make sure that is a good knot. And now I've got it in place well enough that I can get around one more time. All right, and that should hold. Okay, so what we did in summary is we knotted, came around the bar, and then we warped back and forth in this pattern. And each time we crossed the bar, we ran around the knob at the back, came back, and at the end we just knotted it here. So that's warps all set up for you. And now we need to cut our weft thread. So for cutting weft thread, what you want to do is cut a length that's comfortable for you. You're going to be adding thread. I've, you know, in the past tried to cut a length that would do the whole design without me having to add thread. And I'm telling you, it's just not worth it. So just cut a length that works for you. For me, it's a wingspan. For you, it might be a little more, a little less, but something that doesn't tangle and knot on you. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to add thread. So no sweating on that. I just did a wingspan for myself. And then here's the trick that I learned from Meredith for how to thread a needle. If you have some pliers handy, chain nose, or in this case, I'm using some square nose, just flatten the end. And it should go right through your needle. Okay, and then I'm just bringing it down a little bit here, not a lot, folding it over. One way you can get away with working with a long strand of thread is to fold over more of it. And so here's where I do something a little different. I'm going to work from this side here and up. And I've been told that some people loom from the top to the bottom. Meredith was saying that's unusual to start from the bottom to the top. It actually doesn't matter. Whatever is comfortable for you. I just tend to start on this side for some reason. All right, and so another thing that you can kind of optionally do. I'm about to start my weft thread, and I don't knot. So some people will come along and tie a knot on this strand. This is the leftmost. I'm right-handed, so I'm working from my left to my right. Some people will knot onto this strand here. Oh, and guys, I forgot to pull the bar out. I'm so glad I noticed that now. I noticed because it's a little loose, right? So let's do that. I'm using the belly method. I scooted up close to my desk here, and I'm just going to pop that out. And sometimes one side is easier than the other. If you're having any trouble at all, just flip it over. See if you can get it on the other side. I don't know why that works for me, but sometimes if I just turn it. Okay, bar is out. And now look, it's like this tightest guitar string. I'm really glad I noticed that. Okay. And so again, what I was saying about knotting on your warp, you can knot your starting thread by bringing it through and leaving yourself enough tail to weave in. So 7 to 9 inches or so. And you can knot it here, but you don't have to. And I never really do. It's just a habit from how I like to loom, but do feel free to knot if that's helpful. It is helpful to get started if you have a knot there. But alternatively, what you can do is you can just start picking up the beads for your first row, which for us is a pattern of 10, bugle, 10, bugle, 10. And then use your needle to guide it. So let's see here. I'm going to just guide it under there. And then use your finger to hold it in place. Go ahead and just pull your thread through. I'm leaving that tail. I've got a good 9 inches of tail there. And again, I passed underneath. So now what I'm doing is going through my beads on top of these warp threads. So I brought those beads underneath that, right? So my strand it's running inside those beads and it came up underneath. And then I brought my thread over through the beads over these threads. And I did that by kind of pushing up really hard on the beads as I brought my needle through. And as I'm bringing my needle through, I'm kind of pushing up on the needle a little bit to feel the top of the beads I'm going through. And that way I know I didn't puncture any of these. And I know I got on top of the thread. And if it happens that you didn't, you'll find out right away, because when you pull all the way through, I believe the bead will fall below. It'll be loose and you'll see it. So there it is. There's row 1. And I don't knot it. And it actually moves a lot. It has some movement. Meredith and I did a Facebook Live showing a way to weave in your warps using a method that pulls this threads through. And so if you want to check that out, it can help. It's an advanced technique, and using size 10 beads, it makes it even more advanced because they're small and it'll get really tight. But it's just something you can think about. Today, I am going to show weaving them in manually. Okay, so that was row 1. I'm going to do that 2 more times. I'm going to do a little bit fast. So here's my pattern again. Oh, I'm staying on camera here. All right. And again, just going to bring that under. Just use your needle to guide it. Pull that through. And again, I'm still pushing on those beads, and I'm using some pressure on the needle and like kind of an upward pressure there to get those to stay. All right. Okay, and let's get our pattern again. I'm going to make 3 rows. Okay. And I didn't use my needle this time. I have a feeling it's going to work out for me without it. Once you've got a few rows on, they just tend to pop in place like that. Something I love about looming is just the way It kind of works out really well. Okay, so now I'm going to do something a little different. I'm making sure to stay on top of those warps, pulling this through. What I want to do is I want to leave the center empty so that it becomes a buttonhole like this. And it's actually really, really easy to do. Okay, and so what I like to do for, there's more than one way to do this. Lots of great tutorials out there for how to do it. How I like doing it, and then the way that I feel is fastest for me, is I work up this side first. I do that alone. I'm gonna work 12 rows like that. And then I'm gonna come over here and start a new strand and work 12. So here's how that looks. You wanna pick up just 110 and one bugle. And now go ahead and come up through the middle here. So I'm coming up in between these two. This is the center. And flip this up here. Bring that up. All right, and so you come through there and it's just looming this one side. So let's do that a bunch of times. And notice that I'm skipping the rest of the beads in this row. I'm just doing one side. And I'm going to go a little faster just to get us through this part. It helps if you have your button handy, because a lot of buttons are just, they're different sizes, but as you start building your row, you can place your button on top of it, give yourself some extra space, and then you can see what height you need while you're working. So this will work for any button and with any beads. The only caution I have at the end I'll tell you guys about has to do with your shank height, the shank of the button being this part here. Bugles and size 10 seed beads, they're pretty flat. So they are gonna fit really nicely stacked on top of each other. See, when we button it, this one has to fit under this one, right? So your shank height has to be taller than double the height of your bead. It's roughly what I'm saying there. So just something to think about when you're choosing your beads and you're choosing your buttons, but this will work with any size beads. And there's alternative ways to attach your button that solve that height issue as well. I feel like I could teach maybe even, I don't know, 3 or 4 classes just on cool ways to do buttons. But for today, we're just gonna do that shank and, you know, just in the interest of time. All right. And so just keep going. We're doing pretty good on time, but I may not do all 12. I may just, you know, do enough to give you the idea. Let's do a couple more. Also, something else I'm doing, I'm trying to think about good tips and tricks. I'm pulling up with my thread here. When I pull up with the thread, I know I caught this strand. You don't want to not catch the strand, or you'll have a loose bugle hanging there. But the good news is you'll know right away if that happens, because I feel like it kind of jumps out at me when I miss a warp. But it's something to check for. There we go. All right, last one. We'll just do this many.
Hey Danielle, it's Carmi.
Hey.
I didn't want to leave you alone for too long, but I wanted to let you know sidebar is good. Everyone's
cool.
Very, very impressed with the opportunity to add buttonholes. So this is great. So just keep doing what you're doing. Sidebar is great.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's so quiet. So sometimes I'm like, is it good out there? All right. And so I feel like, you know, we'll just make a mini button for this one, and I'll find a little mini button that fits for this. Because I have some samples worked ahead that are tall enough to fit this button. So we'll show that. But I want to make sure I should have time to show you guys this side and then bringing that together. So lots of ways you can do this. A lot of people like to weave back down, travel back through that size 10. and then come up and work this side. But I actually think it's faster and kind of cleaner to work it with a new strand. It's my preferred method, but you can try both, and both of those methods are great. But it's, and when you see, when we get to the end, weaving in, it can be done pretty quickly. So I don't really feel like it takes any longer to weave in a new strand than to weave down. So there's my new strand. I just threaded a needle really quick. And now I'm going to skip this 10 because we don't want to put a 10 in here, right? I'm going to go bugle 10. So here's my bugle. And here's my 10. And I want to come in from the top, right in between here. So I'm going in between, right? In between those. And I'm going to align those like right underneath there like that, see? So my thread's running under, my thread is running under these 3 strands right here. 1, 2, and 3. My thread's running underneath them. I'm leaving a good tail over here so that I have plenty of weaving in, you know, real estate there. And now just same thing as before, just coming in over the top of these 3 warps through my beads. And I'm going to do that a bunch of times. At the end of each one of those pull throughs that I just did, you're going to need to go down through, and bring it over. And then let's bring some beads over here. I like to load them on this side. I don't know why I put the, the beads on that side earlier. That was just silliness. Okay. And so bugle in a 10. Just going to bring that down. And there we go. Same thing as before. I'm just going to come down. Pull over. So bugle in the 10. It's just such a fun way to make your loom designs look just really professional. So I just have a few more to go. And I don't have a count to give you guys. I was trying to develop one. Buttons are tricky because not only do you have to measure their diameters, but you have to think about their height when you think about the size of the buttonhole you need. So like if you have one of those flat metal buttons, those may not need as many rows as a button with some height to it, like this one that's got this big dome on it, right? I probably had to throw an extra row or 2 on there because of that dome. But if you're just using a flat button, and your flat buttons, like let's say it's 12 millimeters or so. Don't quote me on that, but it's about 10. 9 or 10 will do it. Rows of bugles in size 10 Czech. But it's super easy to experiment with it because you can just you can test the button on the loom. You know, while it's like this, you can put the button through it and test it and see, making sure that it fits with some extra wiggle, so that when it's on your wrist, you want to give yourself just a little more to play with. Okay. And another pitfall that I ran into here is these look like they're even, sort of, right? I always count them before I move forward. So let's go, before I forget to do this, let's go down through and let's just count. So over here I had 6, I did 7. So here I have 7. They look even, but I'm just making sure they are. So here's the leftover thread. I've got this side of my buttonhole done, and I've got this thread here. All I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the needle on it and everything. Just set it here, and at the end, I'm going to weave that in. It's just much easier to do later than now. Same thing here with my starting tail. Just getting it out of the way. You can even like put a little piece of Scotch tape and tape it to the back of your loom if it's getting in your way. But now I'm switching back to where we left off over here. Remember, we left this strand. This is our really long working strand. I'm going to start with this one. And so let me bring some of these over here. Going under. So going under, I'll all here. And back to my original pattern. So 10 bugle, 10 bugle, and 10. And closing up the button. And so before I go any further, I would test my button here. So if I had a button that fit this size, which downstairs I have some 12mm flat buttons, and I think they're going to be perfect to go through there. But you would test your button and make sure that it actually goes through, right? And if it doesn't, go ahead and pull this off and make some more rows. And you have this strand free and ready, and you've got this strand free and ready to make more rows if needed. But go ahead and test it at that spot just to make sure you're good. And I'm going to call it good. Get everything out of the way there. And then all you do now is just keep making rows. So let's make 2 more. And then I will switch to one that's in fast forward. So there's that row. Getting that one on there. I tend to load from this side. Notice that. All right. And that's really it. And that's making a buttonhole. And I feel like that's super easy, super versatile technique. If you were working with something like a size 6 seed bead, you just want to keep in mind the height of your shank. But there it is. There's a buttonhole there. And so I'm going to set this one aside and bring on a fast forward one. And let's see, I do have 2, which I feel like this color is a little easier to see. Let's go with this one for that color. It's a little bit better. So what you're seeing here is one that's much further along, and you're seeing lots of crazy strands going along here. So you've got the leftovers from when I did this side of the buttonhole, right? That's these 2 here. Here's my starting weft. Here's where I added thread. So this is about as far as I got before thread needed to be added. And the way that you add thread is the same way we started the buttonhole over here. You just bring a new strand underneath with your new beads and then just start weaving up. Leave your old working thread in place. Just leave it there for now. And I did that twice. Here's another reload up here. Started a new one, left an old one hanging. And here's where I left off. So I'm going to start putting the button on. So here's my button. And give yourself patience. This is tricky. It's not technically tricky. It's just maneuverably awkward to do. And so I just go slow, just take my time with it. And you don't, I just want to make sure I say you don't have to loom your button in. I just wanted to show, something cool that you can do. But for example, if you were working with a size 6 seed bead, most buttons just aren't tall enough to stack 2 size 6s underneath. So you'd probably want to do a version where you stitch it to the top. But in the case of these flat bugles in size 10s, it is really easy to just treat it like a bead and just loom it in there directly. And that's what I'm going to do really quick. So I'm looking at this in about 2 or 3 rows. I'm going to let this shank take the place of 2 or 3 rows of the 10s in the middle. So let's pick up 10. And we'll do a bugle bead. Bring that up. And here's where it gets a little bit awkward. I'm gonna bring my button. So there's a couple ways you can do this. You can try to push the button into it. And you can come underneath it and stitch through it. But what I actually think is easier is I just come up here in between. Go through my button and go back down. And it just gets it started. Now, the next rows, I'm going to have to awkwardly stitch through it. But for this spot, it gets me to where I need to be just a little faster. And I'm gonna have to help it sitting, but at least I know my threads did what they were supposed to do relative to my warps. So now going in there, bringing that down, tightening it up. Now I need another bugle. And I need another size 10. Bring those down. All right, same thing we did before. It's just going to be hard to see. We're coming up, we're going through our beads, and we're going over the warp threads. And here in the middle, I'm going to go through my button. And now when you go through your button, you're over here. And often what I do is I'll just go ahead and pull it through now. I need to get through my bugle. And it's just, you know, it's tricky and awkward, but you can do it. And I'm getting through that bugle, making sure I stay over my warp threads there. So I'm through the bugle, and then I'm going to go through the 10. Making sure that I don't go under my warp thread. Okay. And then if you want to test it, just turn it over and just take a look and make sure you got it. When you're wearing your bracelet, it's going to come up like that. But right now, for clarity, I push it down so I can see what I'm doing and I can see everything's good in there. If you have one of those buttons that has like a skinnier shank, you may not need to do another row, but because this one is so wide, I'm going to need to put at least one more row through it before I start my regular rows back up. So I'm just going to do that really quick. Under here and 10, bugle, and then let's see, through the button shank here, going through it. There's that. Now I need another bugle and another 10. And there's all locked in place there. And if you can get through your next bead, I'm never able to do it, but I always have to just kind of come back and go again through my remaining beads. But if you can get through all 4 beads there, go for it. I just am never really successful at that. I have to come along and find it, go through. I'll try to get through my 10 if I can. Yay, that worked out. So I know it's a little hard to see. So we're getting underneath the button, but staying over those warps. Some bead craziness going on here. I'll move those. Okay. All right, so here's what this looks like. I'm gonna flip it. And it's just locked in there. So now all I gotta do is make regular rows. You can do one more through the shank of the button or not. 2 is fine. 3 is even better if you've got, you know, space for that. I think I might have done 3 on the samples, but 2 or 3 are both fine. So let's pick up a 10 and a bugle, and then a 10, bugle and a 10. And we're just back to our pattern. And another cool thing I want to show you guys, because you're trying to work under the button and it's just such a pain, right? You don't have to, because now we're doing regular rows. Just do it up here. Go through. Just making sure I'm going through it on top of my warps. And then when you tighten it down, go ahead and move it down and give it another pull. And you can do that for as long as you need to, so you don't have to work under your button. Let's do one more, and then how are we doing? Oh my goodness. Wow. I really felt like this would take a lot longer to show. Okay, so here's, I don't know, we might have time for some shenanigans. I can show you guys some extra tips and tricks. I feel like I must have forgot something. There's just no way. It could only be.
Danielle, it's Carmi.
Hey.
Meredith is laughing in the background at
Oh, good.
doing well for time. You are doing well for time, but this is great. If I could just tell you from the sidebar, we're just loving it. We just love the ability to add a button, and Yeah, so you've getting rave reviews on the concept. And I'm just seeing Peggy saying that she's going to be doing it for her granddaughters, and Seema's loving it. So the regulars are here. So just keep doing what you're doing. But you're at the point in your presentation where I can ask you a great question someone noticed. This design, it's works the same front or back. There's no the top or bottom. There's no right size, right?
Correct. Yeah. And in fact, that came up when I first started collaborating with Meredith on Looming. I realized that the way I do it's actually like a little unusual. A lot of people work from the top. They start at the top and they work the other way. And I feel like it doesn't actually matter. Like whichever way you like to do it is perfect.
So we were wondering then, would it be easier if you put the button on opposite, where just the shank showed through?
Oh, you mean just, oh, I see what you mean. Not this way, but yeah, you could. That's a really great idea. Who said that? That person's way clever.
Cindy noticed it. We didn't want to take you off the course, but as you know,
you just changed my whole world. You did. Because you see me going through all that, and I'm like, oh man.
we're like, wait a second. Why don't we just go through the shank and not worry about the button? So again, sidebar to the rescue, more ideas. Danielle learned something.
Why didn't I think of that? Oh my goodness. Okay. You were awesome. Thank you, Cindy. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's like, I never thought of that. And that would be so much easier to do, like way easier than this way. So yeah, scratch all that part. Just do it, flip it, put it underneath. Treat it like a bead from the, yeah, because there's no reason you can't do that at all. That's so cool. Okay, so we've got, we put the button on the hard way. Now I'm gonna show you taking it off the loom and weaving in those pesky warps and all the wefts that we've got hanging out here. So there's a couple things going on back here. You've got your loops going around the button, the knob. And then you've got a knotted area here. So let me get my beads out of the way really quick. And I'm gonna trim these knots. Try to trim it as close to this as you can because you need to weave these in. And there's not a lot of leftover going on here for having enough tail up here at the top. So if you can, in fact, I'm gonna leave that one to the end so I can unwind some of my extra little winding that I did. And let's see. So I do like to use a pair of chain nose or square nose to help me liberate the first loop. If it doesn't just come off with your fingers, you can kind of help it. And I'm pressing the loom against my belly while I'm doing this, just to help me get it free. There we go. And then down here at the bottom, because it's loose, they'll just come right off. So, whoop. And I forgot I'm still attached up there. So that one came off. Okay. I'm gonna clear my mat a little bit. It's really super busy. There we go. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. It's intimidating looking. There's a lot of strands. And it takes a little bit of time. I really don't have a great way to speed it up unless you do there's kind of a complicated way where you pull the warps through. But we did, and Meredith and I did a Facebook Live on that with the caution that try it on some larger beads first. But what I want to show you today is just the standard way of weaving in with a twist. So the reason I'm using some 12s today is because it can really help get in between your weft threads. So let's see how to explain what I'm doing. There's the anatomy of the stitches. We had these warps going, right? And then we went under those warps and then we went over them. So you can actually go in between these two threads as a way to weave in. It saves you, especially with you're using, small beads like this, having to go through multiple passes over and over again on a design like this can be very frustrating. Like if I had to go through these 10s with every single one of these 6 strands, it would get really, really busy really fast. So a trick you can do, don't go through them at all. And just pay attention to where you are. So with this one, I'm exiting from here. So I'm going to skip over my 10. And here, what I'm doing is I'm picking up the bottom warp thread with my needle. And I know this is a little hard to see. There's the bottom warp thread right there. See it? I caught it. It's the one that's running this way. And then bring that down. And I'll do this a few times so we can all see it. Don't pull too hard, just, you know, your loop is going to show. It's not going to take away from the beauty of your work though. And same thing here, just picking up my bottom warp thread. It's the one that's running underneath those beads. I went through 3. 3 is a good number because it really tightens things up. And now I'm going to go through Bugle here. And I'm going to do the same thing again. And what I do is maybe one more set of that. So here's bottom warp. And one more. Around the button, it can be a little tough, but I may have gone through 4 there. That's okay. No problem. And I'm going to exit through this bugle here. And if you wanted to do that one more time, if it's not too difficult to get through your 10 there, if it's this is my first pass, so I've got lots of space still. Again, just picking up bottom warp. And one more. There we go, got it. So this is where having that 12 really helps. So you see how I've got those warp threads. I'm going underneath the bottom one, the one that's running this way through the beads. And pull down. I'm not pulling too, you know, too tight, just a little bit. Go through a bead. If you're using a burner, this is a great place for the burner. If not, just push down with your scissors, pull it. And there's one gone. And then we get to do that a bunch more times. So I thought I'd do it at least once or twice more to show there is a slight difference between weaving in what's left of weft thread and what's weaving in these top ones, because there's a step you got to throw in there. First, you got to cut them. So you've got these loops. Cut them at the very top because you need as much length as you can. So we'll just start with this one. I kind of cut them as I'm weaving them in. I leave the loop alone. So there's no chance my beads will come sliding off that side. I flatten this end. Flatten that one. Okay. Same thing here. I'm looking at where I am. I'm exiting from the side. This is the side of my 10. So I want to go up and over my 10 and down underneath. And there it is again. I caught those. I know it's hard to see, but I'm catching those warp threads. It looks like I missed one in the middle. I don't know if you guys can see that. I'm not going to sweat it. I'm just going to go with it. Go through my bugle. I'm going to travel over here. Why not? I went through the 10 on this case. And it doesn't really matter, you know, where you go, just following that same convention of going under some of those and then through. And so what I would need to do here is do that for the remaining warps. And with this one, see, because it's exiting from here, I would need to come over. Let me show that really quick because it's a little different. And you kind of have a choice spot. Sometimes I can do a needle that way, but it doesn't always work for me. This way it always works. Okay, so if you're here and you know you're exiting from in between the bugle and the 10, you can either come over and go through your 10, or you can go over your bugle and go through your bugle. It doesn't matter which way. I've gone over that 10 a lot of times. I've gone over it twice. So I'm gonna go over my bugle, come through it. No one's gonna see that. Don't worry about that. But you will have your strand visible there. And then again, I've picked up 2 of those. I'm going to pick up 1 more. And then just go ahead and go through. I went all the way through to the side this time. Got those. You'll get quick at it too. You'll start to be able to feel like where those warps are, and going under it won't be as, you know, it won't seem as foreign to you. You'll just be like, yeah, I can kind of tell where that is. And then just go through a bead, pick a bead, any bead, and then trim it. I went through my button shank there, so I'm going to back out. Trim these here. This one is good. I'm going to trim it too. All right, and so I'm getting there, right? It takes a long time. I'll have to sit and do that with this one. And the same thing with this one. When you're on this side here, just go ahead and come up through the bead above or below it, and then just start doing that same thing again. Yeah, so we're doing pretty good. Carmi, can I check in with you and see what your thoughts are? And we've got a good about 13 minutes of extra time.
Exactly. You know what, Danielle, I think if you wouldn't mind, because you said you were going to do it, just will you show them how to weave in from the side?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Especially
let's
when
do that.
From when you've added thread.
Totally. Yeah, let's do that. That's a great one. So I just flatten that end again. And thread that needle. Okay, and so here's where I'm exiting. I'm exiting from this size 10 right here. And there's 2 things you can do. So I get a little picky sometimes with my looming, and like you can go up here down to the next one, but for some reason on the side, the bulkiness of thread shows for me. There's something you can do. Notice where you're exiting, if you're above or below, and then just come above it. So there's thread running down the side, and you can just loop on top of it. So there's one way, and see it hugs that side warp thread, goes right into the bead. Or alternatively, you could just, you know, go to the bead above and below, whichever is the easiest way for you. They're both great. And then just go ahead and find those little strands, go under them and through a bead or 2. And see, there's lots of room down here, so it's so much easier to weave these ones in, I think, than the warps at the top. The warps at the top, it does start getting a little tight because it's getting crowded. There's lots of strands you got to pull in there. And as I'm getting that last strand in up here, I'm always like, I don't know, she can't take much more of this. I get one more in there and that's fine. But yeah. Time consuming, but really, you know, a good way to secure it. So there's that one. And I'll show that one more time.
Danielle,
Okay.
if you're not good at weaving, how would people knot and go? Like, is there, I know you don't like knotting. Meredith is smiling. I know you don't like knotting, but a lot of people may not want to do the extra weaving. Is there a way that you could recommend how to do a knot?
I want to just make sure I understood the question. So there's 2 different things that you could be asking here is if you meant just knotting these up here?
Yes. Is there a way to do this without?
On this design, yes, it would actually be, sorry about that. On this design, it would be super easy because we have these 10s, right? And what I'd recommend doing then is tying the knot over your 10. And then using a little bit of glue to make sure that your knot doesn't come undone, and just trim it as close as you can. And that would be just totally fine. You could also knot it and then pull them through a few beads. But another thing you can do, if you don't like doing that little thread pickup thing that I'm doing, because that's kind of a, you know, it's time consuming. A lot of people just take and just do this. Watch, they just go in through the bead below. So I'm exiting from, here's where I am, I'm right here. I'm just going to go through the bead below it. So this works. It gets bulky, but a lot of people just do this, just zip around.
To be fair, my friends, I
Yes.
both weave in and knot. So I do the weaving in, and then I do some half hitch knots as well. So both ways I think are good ones.
Do you knot here, Meredith? Like, would you do a knot like maybe in between these beads? Like I was just thinking, come down here, come up here. Would you do that?
Yeah, I try to hide my knots. So I do double security. So I'll start by weaving in because I know that's what you kind of are supposed to do. But then I always panic and then I'll do a little half hitch knot and then use my thread burner to burn it off. And I do try to hide that knot as much as possible. Sometimes I'm better at it than other times.
That's good to know. I just tried it here and like, you can't even see my knot. I did a knot right there. I hit it in between the bugle and the 10, and then I went through the 10. I don't know. Do you like it? It seems kind of like it would work fine. My only thing of thinking of up here is that, you know, when we're weaving in like that, is it just gets, you might have to go through some of these beads as many as 7 times in order to do that.
Well, and that's why I wouldn't cut those 2 and knot them over that size 10 orange bead. I would weave them in and then tie the knots, the half hitch knots underneath the shank of the button probably to hide them.
Oh, that's a good idea. That would work too.
I wouldn't want to have that little knot on the end. You know, like
over
to
here, yeah.
be seen right there. Yeah.
Oh, good point. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not good at knotting. That's why I don't do it, is because whenever I do it in places that would be like really dramatically seen. So that's a better idea. Yeah, if you like to knot, definitely using the shank of the button to hide it, that's brilliant. I like that.
Teamwork makes the dream work.
Yeah, exactly. And I was kind of impressed too that hid there. The knot. Oh, go ahead, Carmi.
Danielle, I think you did great, and Sidebar is definitely thanking you for the class. Just because in case it's not obvious to everyone, how does this close now?
Oh, let me bring one of these over. Well, I can show you with this one, but it's not pretty yet, but basically just like that, right? I'll show you on a pretty one here. You just bring it over, and when you're putting it on, it's a little less, easy to do. You have to finagle it a little bit, but it goes on. And you see what I was talking about earlier about the height of your shank, because that's, it's pretty tight there. It's nice and flat, but if you had like a size 6 seed bead design like this, this sandwich would be too thick to fit. I'm hoping that makes sense, but this worked great with 10 with bugles. If you're doing size 6 seed beads, for example, you just want to stitch your button on top. I usually come out of a bead in the center, go through another bead, go through the shank, add another bead, and then go through a bead just below it. Go through that bead, come up, go through that loop again. So kind of like we do on our ends, same thing, but just doing it on top, coming out of the center tens, and that will work fine. And that works for non-shank buttons too. You just do a loop through your your button and whatever structure it has. Yeah. So yeah, it's just super fun. Just another little bit of knowledge there and some new knowledge for me. Thank you, Meredith, and thank you, Cindy, for those tips, because those are going to save me time too.
That's great, Danielle. Thank you. I don't know if you want to say hello to everyone, if you want to switch to your screen.
Yeah. Should we just show the rest of the month really quick?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, so we've got next week on Friday, we're doing some netted hoop earrings. Really fun little design there. And then the Friday after that, we're going to do a bezel cabochon. And it uses size 8s, size 10s, and some delicos at the back there. And that should be, those are 2 really fun designs you guys can join us for. And I hope to see you then. Again, I want to say thank you, Meredith, for being here today and answering questions about the loom and the great tips. And And thank you to everybody for being here with us on Friday. Have a great weekend.